So we will call this meeting to order on November 20th for our policy committee meeting. And first up, we have the approval of our October 25th, 2023 policy committee meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
Motion for approval.
I'll second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Those are approved unanimously. We're going to move on to 1.03, public comment. We have one person signed up for public comment, so Ms. Dirks, welcome. We don't have the timer, so I will set my time.
We know when you're ready.
Okay.
Good morning, members of the policy committee. My name is Missy Dirks, and I'm president of the Frederick County Teachers Association, but I'm here today on behalf of all three bargaining units with concern over the current draft of policy 312 and discussion 314, I'm sorry, and discussion the board had during their November 8th work session on the topic. I was here last spring at the beginning of these discussions, but there are key legal issues that still have not been corrected in the current draft of the policy. Frederick County Teachers Association, the Frederick County Association of School Support Employees, and the Frederick County Administrative and Supervisory Association are the exclusive bargaining agents under Section 6404, Article 7 of the Public School Laws of Maryland, and as such have responsibilities, rights, and privileges that no other person or entity can have pertaining to the school system. One of those inherent rights is the ability to communicate with our members at their place of employment. We will object to any interference by any party in that right to communicate. In fact, that right to communicate with our members and our members to communicate with us is at the core of our ability to carry out our obligation under the law to represent them fully. Furthermore, the negotiated agreements for all three associations in which the Board of Education is a signatory recognize our exclusive bargaining agent status and the right to communicate with members at their work site. The associations take very seriously our responsibilities under the law and the negotiated agreement, and we communicate that to our building reps and our members. As such, we delivered the associate, which was the basis of some of these questions, to the schools by having FCTA and FACE staff drive them to schools. We included updated membership rosters so that they would only be delivered to mailboxes of dues-paying members. And furthermore, in the spirit of cooperation, the three associations did communicate in writing to FCPS Chief of Staff, Dr. Sergo, that in election time in the future, we will include a broader range of association business in our newsletter. We value our partnership and go to great lengths not to use consumable system resources for exclusively election-related materials. The policy in its current draft form would infringe on our association rights, going so far as to dictate what we can say in a meeting exclusively of our dues-paying membership outside their paid duty time. This is interfering with our right as the exclusive bargaining agent and request that it be amended to correct that issue. Thank you, Sharon Eberg, Missy Dirks, and Danny Roth. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our only public comment for today, and we did not receive any written public comments. So we will move on to 1.04, Policy 500, Curriculum and Courses of Study.
So policy 500, curriculum and course of study, is here with a proposed substantive revision. It is coupled with 1.05, item 1.05, which is policy 501, curriculum distribution, which is a decommission because the idea is to collapse the two into policy 500. And I will turn the floor over to Dr. Kevin Cuppett, who is our Chief Academic Officer, to talk through the changes.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Steve indicated, we will be combining 500 and 501 in this submitted request to the policy committee. The reason we're doing that is I think it'll just make everything a lot clearer. It'll clearly define the authority of the board and what's been delegated to the superintendent. And so our approach to doing that, well, in addition to that, we also wanted to make sure that the new policy aligned with policy 444 and policy 117, which is 444 is the educational equity and excellence, and 117 is the anti-racism. And the board had given some very clear direction in both of those policies around curriculum. So you'll see that purpose served here as well. So I think the easiest way to go about this is I'm going to start with both the clean copy and the marked up copy in front of me and work my way through and entertain questions as we go. So the purpose of the policy is to clearly articulate the authority of the Board of Education in regard to matters of curriculum. Very simple. This will define what needs to be board approved. And then in the definitions, you'll notice that the definitions are set up to align to either law or places where we have these definitions defined elsewhere. And so courses was a definition that had existed in the previous policy and regulation. Number 2, digital tools. I did want to point out that is language that's pulled directly out of the new accessibility law in the state of Maryland, 7-910. Many of my colleagues across the state are aligning their policies right now to that new definition to ensure that digital tools are accessible to all students, including those students with visual impairments. As you work your way down, essential curriculum is a definition that carries over from previous work. Number 4, essential curriculum resources. We created that as an umbrella term to talk about any of the resources that we use in our curriculum materials that are not already textbooks, that are not digital tools specifically, and that are not courses and curriculum. So when we bring standards to the Board of Education, new curriculum standards, that doesn't fall under this. This is all those other things that might be supplemental periodicals, it could be websites, drama productions. It's the other things that don't fall under those categories. The textbooks definition comes from our textbook regulation. Materials already in use points to 500-39, which is when a citizen or a parent has a concern about an instructional material. There's a process whereby they can ask for that to be reconsidered. Pilot courses comes from previous work, supplemental text as well. That's all tied to our textbook regulation. So those are the key definitions there. Are there any questions about those definitions? Let's go.
Just one in terms of the digital tools. Do you mean these to be specifically tools that FCPS has purchased and is promoting for use in the classroom, or would it also cover digital tools like ChatGPT or other like AI? Because we've had some conversation here about needing to develop some more specific policy and guidelines around use of AI in our classrooms and with teachers. So is that captured in here, or how do you see that?
It certainly could be.
Okay.
So when I look at this digital tools, I'll just rattle off a couple that you may be familiar with. Our Schoology platform needs to be accessible under the law. Lexia, iReady, ALEX in mathematics, but also our career and technical education programs have a lot of very industry-specific software. So it's really anything that you're putting in front of students. It could be a platform, it could be actual digital content. So online books that students would read all need to meet these new accessibility standards. Now, long story short, the state is now slowly implementing that law. So in October, we actually had to report on the status of our tools around accessibility. Are they or are they not? Or are they when we combine them with another tool? So for instance, we use Read Write Extension, which has things like screen readers and speech to text. If we pair that with a tool, does it then make it accessible? Now, I will tell you, Maryland State Department of Education themselves are trying to figure out how to implement this. So there's a lot of collaboration with local school systems. Separate and apart from that is the decisions around artificial intelligence. We currently have no approved artificial intelligence tools for students. If we were going to move in that direction, we would pull together a group and they would look for a viable option for use with students. We're just not at that point yet. There was some pretty decent guidance given by the U.S. Department of Education that local school systems are starting to sort through themselves. I talked with a couple of my colleagues from other districts. That's where they're starting, because at this time there's no direct guidance from Maryland State Department of Education. And so it's almost like the state entities are either taking a very aggressive approach and putting something in the law or policy, or they're waiting to see what happens with the federal level. So we will probably have to have that conversation around AI, and it would be considered a digital tool under this definition. Okay. Yeah.
And I guess, so would you see that policy falling under this series of policies, or would that be potentially a student-facing policy like in our 400 series, or both? I don't know. It could
So I think this is really around, in this policy, is really around approvals for use. Okay, so how are they selected? How are they identified? How, what's criteria that we use? What's the vetting process? And then how are they adopted? Student use of those things, like in their conduct with digital tools, would probably come under our acceptable use policy, which is the regulations are in 400. Yeah.
Mr. Bass?
Yeah. Materials already in use, you brought up in the context of a reconsideration request. I mean, I don't see that in the definition, so I was surprised that you brought it up in that context. Can you say more?
Yeah. Okay, so you'll see later in the policy where we lay out, this is really to define what is a material already in use. And basically it means anything that we're currently using with students. The exception in the definition is if a textbook is under consideration. So if you remember in our textbook regulation, we're going to get a new sociology textbook. A committee is convened under that regulation. They select one. It's placed out in public review. You can't request to reconsider that because it's not been adopted yet. But if it's in use with students, whether it's a library book, a textbook, some type of instructional material, a digital tool, it is considered a material already in use and is subject to the reconsideration process. And so when we go a little bit later in the policy, you'll see where that's addressed.
And Mr. Bass, I think part of the intention with the definition is to create a uniformity across the different policies. And so if you look at policy 500, or if you look at regulation 500-39, it adopts the exact same definition with the exception of the reference to the textbooks.
Yeah. And so as we move through this, as Mr. Bolivis has pointed out, once the policy is set and you feel comfortable that this is where you go, there are a series of regulations that we would then need to align to the work that you're doing. We already have those queued up. I actually have teams that have volunteered to start working on those. So once this comes through, the regulations will be aligned pretty quickly thereafter.
Mr. Rose, do you have any questions?
No, I think you guys covered it. Thank you.
So the next section, policy statement, section C, pulls together from 500, from 501, from 444, and from 117. You'll see where we have highlighted where those come from. As I said, the board had done some high quality work around lensing curriculum from an equity perspective and anti-racism perspective. And so we simply brought that language over, and that's where 1, 2, and 3 come from. And you'll see notated there what's 444 and what's 117. Then when you start in numbered areas 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, that is the bringing together of 500 and 501. So just for reference for anybody who's listening, 500 previously was called Curriculum and Courses of Study, and that was when we would bring to the board curriculum standards, like the change in the 3rd grade social studies standards. We'd bring those forward for approval, and any courses of study. So every year in March, we bring forward, hey, we're going to try a new course. We're going to do a Black African American Studies course. This is the framework for it. This is the standards, and we're seeking approval from the board for that course. 501 really dealt with selection and review of instructional materials. Well, the reason we're combining it, it's pretty obvious, right? Things like approving curriculum courses have to be done in connection with the instructional materials there. We don't come forward to a course to teachers and say, go teach this without having a textbook, if that's appropriate, quality instructional materials for them, and curriculum standards. And so that's why we felt really combining them would be important. So as you can see here, one of the things that we've added in number 4, based on the recent board decision, is that here are the things that must come to the board. It's always been the essential curriculum. Any new or pilot courses have always had to come to the board, as well as textbooks. And then we added any materials of instruction used in family life and human sexuality within the health education. That aligns with what the board had decided just recently. One of the other key components in both of the policies is this opportunity for review by the public. So courses, textbooks, the family life materials, any curriculum standards, those are all placed out on board docs prior to approval. Oftentimes it'll come, for instance, we'll have curriculum standards come to the C&I committee. They're discussed openly, those are posted, we accept public comment, and then they usually move forward about 2 weeks later to the consent agenda with the board, where somebody could also have conversation around those and provide public comment. With the family life and human sexuality materials, we send out a communication that these resources are going to be discussed at a FLAC meeting in advance. They can, people can view those resources before they even come to the meeting. There's an opportunity for public comment there. Then it'll now move forward to the board for approval. So there's that request to have transparency in the board policy that we made sure was present here. And then the number 5 is the, hey, don't change it on us clause, I would say, where we in the curriculum department will never make substantive changes to things that you've already approved without letting you know. So I'll give you a way that that works out practically. So if we presented you a set of standards in sociology, and the national sociological organizations are requesting changes in some of those standards, and it's around sensitive topics, and it's significant, even though it might only be 2 of 40 standards in there. If we think that's a substantive change, we always bring that back to the board. Here's the national organization, here's what MSD is saying, here's what we'd like to do in Frederick County Public Schools. A textbook. If we have been using a textbook in elementary mathematics for 6 years and it goes into life and that contract expires, and we are going to get a brand new textbook, then that goes all the way through our textbook approval process. There are some instances where, say, we've picked a book on a government electives course or something, and we purchased that and it was out there for about 4 years, and then we found out they're going to do an edition change. Our curriculum specialists will review that edition change. If there's nothing major in that, we just make that a technical approval. So there's no substantive changes. But if we were going to engage and get a brand new textbook, then that would come through. So that's the don't change it on us without our approval section. In section 6, this is the board's encouragement that we have pilot programs available. And just so you know, the pilot courses can be either generated by us centrally, but there's actually a process in FCPS where teachers can propose pilot courses. And if you remember, we've talked in the past about the 9/11 to the present course. It was actually a teacher-driven course that we worked in collaboration with the teachers in the field to create those. And so there's always been an encouragement of that from our Board of Education. And then if we move to 7, that has been struck. That's an old provision back in the day when HIV/AIDS was maybe a little more controversial. There was discussion about that. All that is now covered in our disease prevention units. So then if you go to number 8, this is where the board now is delegating to the superintendent responsibility for those curriculum instructional materials. It's all the other things that support instruction. And you can see that that's now being delegated. And number 9 and 10 are new language. 9 is the board delegating the superintendent other specific types of instructional materials that include things like drama productions, digital tools or software, and ensuring that there are processes and criteria that make sure that those selections comply with law and that they comply with other policies and regulations. So one of the areas of law that we always comply with is our purchasing and procurement laws. So that would all be part of any regulation that the superintendent would create. And then the number 10, Mr. Bass, you'll see there, the superintendent is authorized to adopt regulations to review materials of instructions already in use if a citizen of Frederick County objects to it. So as you think about our follow-up in regulation, there's going to be a new digital tools regulation for number 9. We're going to revise and edit 539, which is reconsideration of instructional materials in use. And so the spillover into our regulations will happen over the next few months. When you go down to D, this is implementation. You can see that there is currently a textbook regulation. And so that will be aligned to this policy. So A requires the superintendent to have that process, which we do, and then that those textbooks have to be approved by the board. 2 is the curriculum courses and pilot courses. 3 is those essential curriculum resources, those additional materials that we use. And 4 is the digital tools, again, directing the superintendent to have regulations and approval of digital tools. I would say that regulation almost will write itself because we already have really clear standard operating procedures related to this. And if you remember when we came, I think not the last time when Mr. Murphy and Ms. Gull were here, but when I was here, might have been in the summer, we said that there are a lot of things that we do in standard operating procedure that are really good practice. And we felt, and the board seemed to have interest at the time, of bringing that up to the regulation level so that it's publicly facing and everybody knows what our practices are. So that'll happen with our digital tools regulation. And then when the last one, 5, is the reconsideration materials already in use, Mr. Bass. And so that's the language that's listed related to that. So that takes all of the responsibility that the board has in the 2 current policies, defines that, and then clearly defines what is directed to the superintendent for management through our regulations. Any questions?
I just have 2 maybe potential language tweaks. That might be a question. In C4, I'm wondering if we could either add or change the language around parents to say caregivers or parents/caregivers. Just trying to use some inclusive language in that area.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we have, Mr. Lewis, do we have a standard use of references to parents/caregivers?
Off the top of my head, I do not know. I'd have to go back and kind of survey some of our policies to see what they say.
I have no objection to parents, caregivers at all. Absolutely, yeah.
And then my other, question or language tweak is under D2. So in 1, under textbooks, it says the board requires the superintendent to outline a process and criteria in regulation. So that's specific that process and criteria will be in regulation. Should that same language be mirrored in 2A? So just adding in regulation after criteria, just so that we're specific and consistent on where that process is outlined. But otherwise, I think this is fantastic. I really appreciate the pulling in of language from 117 and 444 and just sort of making this whole policy much more clear and specific. So I really appreciate it. And thank you for the work that you did. Mr. Bass, Mr. Rose, Mr. Mish, any questions or comments?
I do.
Do you want to go first, Mr. Rose?
Sure, if it's all right, I will. That's fine. So just a couple. One's a typographical. Just wanted to make sure because could be easy to miss. We're eliminating 7 under C. So of course all the subsequent ones after that will be 7, 8, 9. Just want to make sure we're got our numbering right.
We'll make sure that's clean on the final clean version.
And then I had a question on C4, and I just wondered, would it be appropriate under C4 to articulate our revised process for review and approval of the family life and human sexuality materials? If we just added a sentence or 2 there, about how we've revised that process regarding FLAC reviews and recommends. I know we do articulate there that the board makes final approval, but I just wonder if it would be appropriate to articulate that FLAC still reviews those materials and makes recommendations that are then, final approval by the board.
So would that be something to the effect of, Mr. Rose, that upon review and approval of materials by the Family Life Advisory Committee, the board will make final approval materials, something like that, but basically still show that things are going to FLAC. FLAC is making recommendations, and then the board makes final decision.
And I think that recommendation word from FLAC is probably key rather than approval.
Okay.
because It's recommendation for approval.
For approval,
to the
yeah.
board.
Yes,
Okay.
I agree. Yep, recommendation for approval and then the board. So if we could articulate that. And then I had a question around what would ultimately be, it's 10, would be ultimately be 9, where it says the superintendent is authorized to adopt regulations to review material instruction already in use if a citizen of Frederick County objects. I wonder if we paint the superintendent with that language into a corner by saying a citizen, where it wouldn't be a bad thing if we said if members of the Frederick County community, and then in regulation, we can still have a discussion whether I still have a problem that one person can raise their hand and force us into a rather expensive and long drawn out process of review of educational materials. So I just don't want to paint ourselves into a corner under this policy by saying a citizen. I'd feel more comfortable if we said members of the Frederick County community. I don't know how the other members feel about that.
I am really glad you went first because I was trying to figure out how to articulate similar concerns. I like the language you're proposing.
And that's it. If everyone else is comfortable with that, that's the only questions I had.
So can I ask a clarifying question about that? So, Mr. Rose, when you change it from the term citizen to member of the FCPS community,
Members of the Frederick County community.
Frederick County community. Okay. So let me just, knowing the phone calls that I occasionally will get on matters. So if the someone lives in one of our communities, Brunswick, Frederick City, and they request reconsideration, then under that language, we would certainly do that. They're a member of the Frederick County community. If someone from Colorado submits a request for reconsideration for a book that we're using here,
I mean, I would say no, and I am curious, under current regulation, of our curricular materials?
no, because they're not a citizen.
So it's the word citizen that.
So I
exists in
think,
current-
I don't know the history behind the use of that term, but citizen's a pretty specific legal term, meaning, I would assume meaning having residency here in the county.
Yeah, but I mean, we have plenty of parents who are not US citizens. I think it's not a inclusive term.
Okay. Could it be resident?
Rather than members.
Well, and the question would be, what if I'm the father or mother of students in Frederick County Public Schools, but I happen to live in Pennsylvania or in Loudoun County or.
So I think the solution to this is we can use the members of the Frederick County community language and then add a definition of what does it mean to be a member of the Frederick County community, which would allow, us to try and work through what that would be without having to try and do it, during the course of this policy committee meeting.
Yeah, I'm more interested in making sure in policy, at least, that it's plural, that we're not restricting the superintendent by saying only one member of the community. I just want to give us some leeway there. I'll leave it to Mr. Blevis and Dr. Cuppet to work out the language that's appropriate for us to articulate that. So thank you.
Yeah, one additional question.
Uh-huh.
So under policy statement, right, C1, this is new language. I recognize that that connects, yeah, I believe this is new language that connects our curriculum materials to, say, the anti-racism policy and the educational equity policy. But some of my question is, do you have any current examples of how we have been able to connect curriculum to these policies, or any ways that you anticipate that? Some of my question is simple. I've always served on policy and never served on CNI, so I haven't necessarily seen this, I don't know, directly in action.
Yeah.
So
So how is 444 and 117, how are they impacting what we do in the curriculum office? Is the question I'm hearing. So I'll just give you one example. Mr. Murphy and a group of our curriculum specialists had looked at our textbook approval process. So in the regulation, it lays out that there are criteria that we should have associated with selection of our textbooks. And they worked with our equity office here in Frederick County Public Schools and came up with rubric criteria, things to look for. And so a couple of things that we would look for in a textbook is there adequate representation of all students in the materials? Like, we don't want to adopt a textbook that doesn't favorably show all kinds of kids so that they can see themselves in the textbook materials. We might be looking at the way that they handle particular topics. Are the ways that topics handled, are they biased, or do they unintentionally disfavor underrepresented populations? We also have, a look against stereotypes when we look across the imagery of the textbook. Is there imagery or content that actually supports a stereotype rather than challenge that? So that new rubric criteria that we've done, it also includes accessibility, which is the new law. That information is now functional. We have 2 curriculum specialists right now using that new language and new rubric as they evaluate textbooks right now, one in math or English language arts and the other one in a world language. So that's some of the practical influence that you'll see on what we do. We also, in curriculum, this is outside approval of materials, we certainly want our professional learning to be equity focused in what we do. And so one of the things that we might do is we might feel that in a particular content area, some of our teachers need additional training. So Colleen Bernard, who's our curriculum specialist in secondary social studies, has done a lot of professional learning to empower teachers to how to handle difficult conversations and difficult content, because that comes up in social studies quite a bit, not only by the difficulty of the concept that existed in history, but also those modern things that occur in our environment that are impacted by history or relate back to history. And so she's done a lot of great professional learning around that. So there's a lot of different ways this manifests itself. And I think you'll see that as regulations get updated and published, you'll probably see the fingerprint of that as well.
thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
No, I appreciate that it seems to be a little more concise and easier for someone who is not well-versed in all of this policy and where to find things. I think it makes sense to put everything where it did. And I appreciate the additional edits. So I like it. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
So this is listed as an action
Mhm.
item, so we need to determine if we would like it to come back
Yep.
for the policy committee to look at some of these tweaks, or if we're ready to send it on for first reading.
So while you consider that, I will add that one of the things that I want to go back and do is just make sure that the items reflected in C 8, 9, and 10, which are the superintendent's delegations, aren't duplicative of what is in the corresponding sections in implementation. I'm just wondering if there's a way we might be able to, without substantively changing anything, just condense the policy a little further and combine those two. So we're going to take another look at that piece. I just missed that when we were looking at this, getting it ready.
Was there any preference on if we would like the revisions to come back to policy before it goes
my preference is to move this along to the full board. I'm curious what other members.
Mr. Rose?
Yeah, I think in that first reading, we would have an opportunity before the full board to review these slight revisions that we're making here, but yet still move the process along. And then if it needs to come back after a first reading, we can do so, but maybe not. And that might, because I wanted to add and kind of reemphasize something Ms. Gallagher said. I really appreciate how this new policy articulates what 500 and 501 should have said. So I really appreciate that. So yes, I would support moving this forward to first reading.
Okay, I'm on board with that, so.
And then corresponding to that, we need a similar action for for moving forward on policy 500 to be decommissioned as a move to first reading.
500, 501.
Or
501.
501, sorry,
Mhm.
501. Yeah, we're gonna strike the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm good with pairing those, to the board unless there's any objections.
Just as a reminder to the policy committee, 501 being decommissioned, it'll rise like the Phoenix, probably as a different policy when we talk about library media instructional materials. And so we'll use that probably that same number. But we'll have a moment of silence for it for now,
Okay.
and then it'll come back as something else. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
So that moves us right along to back to one of our favorites, an encore of policy 114.
Policy 114, like the Phoenix, rises again. So a request was made at the last board meeting to bring this back for some clarifying revisions. In addition to the revisions that were requested, I did do a little other cleanup. And then there is one other item that isn't reflected here that I'm going to ask for permission of the policy committee to do with respect to or to propose with respect to the template. So if you turn to page 2 of the, do I have the line open? Oh, yeah, I do. If you turn to page 2, it's D3D little 4. It's the very last line on page 2. The policy committee shall not meet unless at least 2 voting members of the committee are available. With Ms. McNeish's joining, I wanted to make it clear, I thought it was necessary to clarify that it had to be 2 voting members be present for a policy committee meeting to move forward. Because while we certainly value your input and feedback, having only you and one other member here would not give us the quorum we would need to have a vote. And so that was a clarification I thought was needed. And then if you go down to page 4, in the C, the sub, this is where we have kind of talked about it being changed from non-technical to substantive to make it easier for everyone to understand. Well, this is where I've made that change. And then in C2, I've mapped out the pathway that the board asked for actions. And so rather than just saying it will be presented at the next reading for the second, or next board meeting for the second reading, it will now say at the conclusion of the first reading, the board will determine whether the policy should be returned to the policy committee for further consideration, advanced to a second and final reading at the next available regular meeting or work session, or advanced to the second and final reading as an action consent item at the next regular meeting of the board. So those are the 3 choices that you basically have when sitting as the board, and it outlines that you're going to make that assessment at the end of the first reading.
I think this definitely captures the discussion that we had. Does this mean that at each first reading, the policy will be listed as an action item, and these will be the actions that are available to us?
Yes, we will have to list it as an action item with these being the 3 action choices.
I am very comfortable with this. I think I was comfortable with the policy as written previously. But yes, I'd like to move forward with this policy as written.
I agree.
So the one other change that I would like to make to the template that I've come to realize is kind of a vestige of old times that don't need to be there. If you go down to the policy history at the bottom, you'll see that there's the second row is for related regulations. And that made sense under the old form of the template that was being used, or old format that was not a template. But now that we have section E for related information, the related regulations can really live there. And so I would like to remove that from policy history and just make that a part of the related information when there's a regulation to refer to.
I agree.
You'll change the template for.
I will, oh yeah, I'll update the template. Let's move to, all right, so
So because of this change,
So this one's going to have to go back and fix all the ones we've just done. We're going to let them live and.
well, we'll let them live for now because we've got enough work to do. We can let
Okay.
them live. You know, as things do come up and we see them, we can always, you know, and those would be technical amendment changes anyway that really would go to the board as this is a technical amendment. All we've done is delete this and moved it up, and the board can adopt it.
It'll be
in
moving
one
forward
writing.
anyway.
yeah, and in terms of 114, are we going to bring this back to the full?
Yeah, this has to go back to,
Go back because it was a
this goes back as a first reading because it is a change to an existing policy, just like any other. So we use the current process until we change the process. So that brings us to policy 109, which is item 1.07 on the agenda. This too is returning to the policy committee after further edits were requested. And also this was presented to the ethics panel to get feedback from their perspective. And so what you'll see, what I have done here to help kind of see the difference between what was previously presented as a change and what is now presented as a change is I've added purple. We had blue and red before, now we've added purple. The purple reflects the changes between the last time we presented this to policy and today. So for example, the last time we met, I suggested we may want to change the title. And so now the title of this policy is going to be Board and Board Candidate Ethics, and the Board and Board Candidate is in purple to reflect that. So I will jump you down to page 2, section C4. This is a new section that I have incorporated into the policy statement to reflect the student member of the board. I generated this largely coming out of the discussions that were had at the board meetings about whether the student member of the board should have voting rights. If the student member of the board is going to have voting rights, then there should really be a statement as to the expectation with respect to the ethics associated with that student member's right to vote. Now, there's a lot in this policy that's just not going to be applicable to the student member of the board. They're not going to own land. They're not going to own stocks. You know, we don't need them to do a financial disclosure. But I do think there's a place for a student member of the board to indicate if they are working a job outside of school and earning income from someone who may be a vendor or a provider to FCPS. I think there's value in requiring them to report that, very much like we would require a member of the board to report that.
I would just be curious if counties that have given more full voting rights, if there's any requirement that the student member of the board does a more full financial disclosure of their parents' income. If other counties don't do that, I'm comfortable with this, but I'd be curious what's done.
My review of other counties is none of them require the student member of the board to do any kind of disclosures. This would be a step, a more progressive step.
They don't even address it. They don't
Yeah.
even speak to it.
And would you recommend including this language, even though we're sort of in this gray area of whether our SMOB will have voting rights or not? Just, we're in a gray area right now because no determination has been made.
Right, and any determination would be subject to legislative, changes anyway. So we could certainly revise forward to say this term will only implement if the student member of the board is granted voting rights. Or we can take it out and I could just keep it in the archive and we can bring it back if the student member of the board does get voting rights sometime down the road.
Yeah, I mean, the student member of the board hasn't shown up in this policy until now. So it's sort of also a question of acknowledgement that they are a member and the extent to which this is relevant for them. I actually, while it may have been triggered by the conversation, it doesn't really address voting rights at all. It's sort of an acknowledgement of their membership and sort of what within this even applies to them generally, so.
Yeah, I'm okay with like the
I
language
agree.
in here even, like regardless of what.
So the next place where you will see purple is down in the constitution or the composition of the ethics panel. A lot of that is just cleanup language. What is new is little 4 IV. A member may be removed from the ethics panel by the board or on its own initiative, or on the recommendation of 5 ethics panel members. We currently don't have a stated mechanism for removing a member of the ethics panel. I think it's inherent that the board can do it, but I also have seen that articulation in other policies. And in particular, we have currently a member designated on the ethics panel who I have yet to meet. And we've had, I think, 4 or 5 ethics panel meetings. She's yet to show up. She's not responded to email. She's not responded to phone calls. And the only reason I haven't brought it to the board yet is because her term expires in June. And she's not up for reappointment because it's already her 2nd term. So what's the point at this point? Well, we can ride with the 6 that show up. But this gives a mechanism for that to happen in the future if a similar circumstance were to arise. So if you move down to page 3, under C, responsibilities, the 3rd paragraph, 3 little i's. At the end of that paragraph, I've added a statement about advisory opinions being reviewed by the board upon written request. Again, I think it is inherent in the board's authority over the ethics panel to receive appeals of decisions that were adverse, but it's not expressly articulated. And so this does that. This expressly creates the process. It says we're going to use the board's 105 policy for hearing and appeals, and it will be treated as a 4205C appeal. And so, this just sets up a policy for how that's going to happen. And then if you go down to page 5, you'll see in the last line right above post-employment lobbying restrictions, you'll see I've made the change of board candidate to be a member of the board to board candidate. You're going to see that throughout. I'm not going to point it out every time, but that was one of the items that I think that was expressed during the board meeting was, can that be cleaned up? Or during the policy meeting is, can that be cleaned up? And certainly it can. And then likewise, if you go down to D3, this is where the paragraph addressing when a board member is eligible to be hired by FCPS. We've taken the request of the board and changed it from be employed by to may not seek or gain employment, which would include the interview or application and interview process. And then all the way down on page 11, nope, bottom of page 11, you'll see that, again, reflective of the policy committee's request to try and highlight where things are being relocated from one policy to another. I've added the bubble comment on the side that reflects that the financial disclosures for employees is moving to policy 305, conflicts of interest and employee ethics. And that's just the first instance of it. Again, I'm not going to go through. You can see where it lives. So those are the changes that we are proposing to policy 109 based on the last time the policy committee reviewed this.
One language tweak again from me, and it's just around the board candidates versus candidates to be members of the board. I saw that it was captured throughout, except under page 2C.
Page 2.
See policy statement 3. It's still recommended. That was the only one that I
I
caught.
missed
so
one.
I went through.
Good catch, though.
Um,
Wow.
And then I have one other question that may be overthinking, but I think it's worth asking before we potentially move this policy forward is around gifts. Which I don't, oh, it is defined. Never mind. The definition answers my question.
So,
Scratch that.
Actually, I'm glad you bring that up though, because there is one item with respect to gifts that's reflected in 305 that isn't reflected in 109 that we may want to incorporate into 109. And yeah, that's largely because I was finishing up 305 after 109 was already submitted to board docs. And the two things that are reflected in 309 are aggregated gifts from groups of employees. And 305, I'm sorry, aggregated gifts for groups of employees, and crowdsourced monetary gifts from sites like GoFundMe. Now, I don't know whether the State Ethics Commission will approve the insertion of these two items. These are not listed in the law at the moment. They may eventually someday get there. The aggregated gifts is a common practice, and there is reference in other documentation we have to the aggregated gifts. And then the crowdsourced monetary gifts comes from an opinion of the Frederick County Ethics Commission with respect to a crowdsourced site or a GoFundMe site that was set up for a family whose one of the parents died. And so there was a big discussion about who could they receive gifts from in that context? Who could the board member or the council member receive gifts from? And so I thought it made sense to incorporate it. I think it probably makes sense to incorporate it into 109 as well. But that's up to you.
I don't know. I have a lot of questions and comments on 305. So I don't know, but maybe we can have that discussion.
Well, and the other thing I will say is we do need action on 109 and 305, but you have different options for action because before we can implement changes to the ethics policy, it has to go through the state commission's review and approval. So we can either send it to the state commission coming out of the policy committee, or we can wait till the board approves it and then send it to the state commission for approval coming out of the board. I tend to lean towards let's get the policy, let's do it after policy committee. Let's not ask the board to approve something the state's not going to bless. Because if we go through all this big discussion about crowdsourced gifts, and then the state says, no, you can't have that language, we've spent a lot of our board time discussing something that can't be in place anyway. So
As long as there's an understanding that it would go to the state board, if they approve, it would come back to the
Oh, yes.
full board.
yes, it still has to come back to the full board. Yes.
It's like a non-binding approval.
Well, I mean, it's binding in the sense that we, they can
can't
tell
make-
they can
skip the
tell us.
approval process here.
Yeah, it doesn't circumvent your authority, but the state also has to take a look at it and make sure that they're comfortable with the edits that we're making.
The question before us, and as it relates to 109, is whether we would want to include the language or similar language that was added to policy 305 under the gift from a group of board members, I guess, and crowdsourcing monetary gifts to policy 109. And then we'll get to policy 305 once we make that determination.
Yes.
Well, and respond to any other questions. Mr. Bass, Mr. Rose.
Well, I have a specific question on gifts as well. I guess here's a scenario, and I want to see your thoughts on how it relates to this policy. Say that board members are attending a conference and there's an organization that is offering a dinner buffet free of charge. Conceivably, just the cost of dinners at a restaurant, conceivably that is more than $20 a person. is, how would you, if we adopt this policy as written, although actually current policy is the $20 limit, how do you recommend board members handle that situation?
That falls within the existing language in an official may accept meals and beverages consumed in the presence of the donor or sponsoring entity. So there you have, you're at a conference, which travel to a conference can be is permissible. We do travel to conference, and it can be paid for if you're presenting at it. You are allowed to eat the meals that come along with going to a conference.
Yes. Yeah, I wonder if there is a distinction, though. I think that there's a certain amount of money. It's actually much higher than I ever anticipated. I think $75 for meals when you're traveling on official business, but that would be a meal you purchase on your own, not an organization offering a free meal to.
Well, they're offering the free meal to conference attendees. It's not a direct gift to you as an individual.
Correct.
It's it's sort of the notion of how conferences are structured, which is they agree to sponsor certain things. So you're not, it's part of being a conference attendee versus them taking you out to dinner as a board member.
And so your take is, as I've described it, that would fall under an official may accept meals and beverages consumed in the presence of the donor or sponsoring entity?
That would be my take on it. If there is, but I mean, frankly, if you have a concern about that scenario, my recommendation is to put in a request to the ethics panel for an advisory opinion, because it is their purview to make those kinds of assessments.
Yeah.
That was my question on that.
Okay.
A second question that I'd like to just get some thoughts on. With prestige of office, do we think that an individual board member endorsing another political candidate, would that fall at all, do you think, under prestige of office? What are our thoughts on that?
So I think that's a question that the ethics panel should be the one to weigh in on. I think there is certainly room within F1, which is on the red line copy, it's page 5 of 14. An official may not intentionally use the prestige of office or public position for the private gain of that official or the private gain of another. And I think in that context, it's conceivable that if I were to stand up and say, or Mr. Bass, if you were to stand up and say, I, David Bass, member of the Board of Education, endorse Stephen Blivis to, be the next, president of the world, that, look, if I'm going to aim big, I'm going to aim big, right? There you are using the prestige. It may be construed as using the prestige of your office to support me individually, and that I think could conceivably be found to be a violation. That would be up to the ethics panel to give an opinion on.
But in this case as well, you feel the structure is in place both already and in the proposed policy, that we have a strong ethics panel. You can refer items to there to get a ruling.
An advisory opinion, or if you believe someone did something already, then you file a complaint, and they will. There's a whole investigative process for the complaint, for reviewing a complaint. Haven't had one of those yet so far. That's a good thing. No, advisory opinions are great, because that means people are coming to us to ask, can we do this? As opposed to, I'm going to do it and then, pay, I'll deal with the issues later, right?
What about the use of the word private gain in there? So, I don't know, in that example, more of a public gain, I don't know.
I was thinking about that, but I still, I realize this is somewhat, not separate, but adjacent to reviewing this policy, but it is interesting to think about ways that this can affect things. But I was thinking about that, but there is a way that, so you're saying because other office or someone, that's public gain, not private gain.
So this is the notion, arguably, of in an election cycle, Do board members on the Frederick Board of Education historically endorse potential candidates or members of the board?
I think there's been a wide range of practice.
Right, so it sounds like then the question would be really directed prior to the next election cycle to the ethics panel for an advisory opinion, so current board members know where the boundaries are.
Well, and I think one of the other challenges though is I mean, often board members themselves run for,
Right, reelection or other office.
other offices while they're sitting members of the board. I mean, we have that
Yeah.
situation currently right now. And so,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's something to really consider, someone maybe asking for an opinion on.
Those were my questions.
Mr. Rose?
I'm kind of glad you mentioned that one issue about the post. I want to go back to D, the post-employment and lobbying restrictions, just to touch on that. I think I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but I didn't want how that might apply to a situation where a sitting board member is running for another position that will be compensated, and they may well represent a party in board-like business. I didn't know if we needed to have something in there that excluded, I just wouldn't want that to be used against someone that's sitting on the county council or one of our delegates or running for office that, hey, look at you, you're violating your own existing policy by running for an office in which you will have a say over board business. Does that make some sense? That
I mean, I think it does. I would certainly say to anyone who is an elected official or a member of the board that is about to engage in any election-based work, it would be advisable to seek an opinion. That would be my 2 cents. Mr. Blivis, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so again, the interpretation of this policy is really in the hands of the ethics panel. So I don't want to go too far into the scope of their authority. I'm looking at all 4 existing sections of the post-employment lobbying restrictions, and the policy just doesn't speak to someone being elected into another position. So, on its face, there's no clear statement that you can or cannot, or that what happens when you do. And by that omission, it is, open to being done and without concern about, well, now I can go to the county council and serve as serve in the capacity of reviewing the board's budget request. I don't see that. I mean, that's not in here now. That's not addressed. So by omission, there's no reason why that couldn't happen. But I would leave it to the ethics panel to consider and provide the opinion of the group.
Yeah, it just gives me pause because we have in the past, we have had former board members. One, obviously they've run for other offices, but we've even had other former board members take employment with the county or city and work on things that may be relative to the board's work.
So my understanding is the limitations of this policy govern things within the scope of the board's authority. So we don't have the ability to legislate someone taking a job with the Frederick County government or the Maryland legislature. We can't govern that. They're not bound to anything that's in board policy once they are no longer a member of the board in that way. The board's limits of authority are associated to employment with the school system, and that is the extent to which the language speaks to.
So I think the place where Ms. Rose, your concern may most be applicable is if you were to take a position leaving the board, and in that position you were directly asked by the county as part of your job responsibilities to work on something that was related directly to what you were working on as a board member. So I'm trying to come up with an example. I'm trying to come up with an example on the fly, and I'm having a hard time coming up with one that actually is plausible. But I think if that were the circumstance, you would have to tell the employer, I can't do that. I'm barred by the policy that I agreed to when I was a board member to not work on things that I worked on when I was there.
I have a question, but Mr. Rose, I don't want to interrupt you.
Is it really?
It is.
No, that's fine. Fine. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, I have been very, a strong advocate for the delay in applying for jobs within FCPS. On this issue, I don't, on some level, I wonder if we're being too restrictive because we as FCPS can and ought to set boundaries on what former board members apply to, but it seems over the top to restrict what former board members do with other entities. not
So-
And I don't think
FCPS.
you can.
So the-
So then should this be changed?
No, no,
or-
because this is over working for us.
So there's a couple of pieces to this. This in part directs you when you can come back to work for FCPS. We can certainly control and regulate who we want to come work for us and what timeframes we want to apply to them. Generally speaking, the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, who is the authority who issues information about what the expectations are nationally about employment, they very much disfavor language in contracts that would non-compete language that makes it hard for someone to go get work. That is something that the National Labor Relations Board is very much not in favor of at the moment. I say that only to say that, to Dr. Sergo's point, it would be very hard for us to put in our policy to say you can't go work for the city or the county. I question whether the National Labor Relations Board would say that's not permissible. What the language that currently exists is there to do is to say, I can't be working on something, I can't be working on something as a board member reviewing a contract with Microsoft to say we're going to give all of our technology support needs to Microsoft at a $10 million a year valuation. And then all of a sudden, oh, look at that, I've now gone and taken a job with Microsoft. That's what this language is intended to prevent. And that's really what item D1, which is existing language, which is, it's just, that's what we have. That's not changing. That's the intention. It's not there to say you can't go work for the city, you can't go work for the county. It's not saying you can't go work for Microsoft. It's saying you can't do it if you were heavily involved in creating something or providing some resource, the expenditure of our money in the process.
It's D2 that I'm most concerned about. When it says subject of legislative action, that, I think that's pretty wide.
Well,
E2?
No,
D2, it's on page 5. Well, I mean, legislative action is very narrow. I mean, that's only if that's really goes towards the lobbying to some degree, even though there's also a separate section about lobbying.
Being an elected official in the legislature.
Right,
Well, I mean, I see Mr. Bass's point. So a former elected official may not assist or represent another party for compensation in a matter that is the subject of legislative action. So would you consider, well, one, I think this does, try and legislate how somebody who's a former elected official can engage. But if the legislative action is part of, say, an elected position that they
but
get.
here's the distinction, and I'm going to draw it for you. Try and draw it as clean as I can. There is a difference between an elected official who, amongst their many responsibilities, amongst the many bills they may be considering, amongst the many laws they support, has one small piece of their work that relates to something that we do here, as opposed to a lobbyist whose job it is to focus on, this is what change I want to happen. Those are two very different functions. And I think that the the view of the elected official more broadly, because this is just a small piece of the work that they would be doing, it would not be, I don't think it would be viewed as a violation of any kind.
And I don't know that the board has to, the language is there as an anchor, but lots of the discussion you're starting to get into are the things that really belong in the ethics panel around specific scenarios. And it's important to consider all of the different ones to make sure that the language applies, but it's hard to write a policy that covers every potential scenario. And so you just want to have one that has at least some governing guardrails. And then as issues and incidents come up, that's how the advisory opinion can really help. But this is existing language. We didn't add that.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I told you this question was going to send us down a rabbit hole. So
Little bit.
I apologize for that, but I appreciate this discussion because just that last bit of discussion there made me feel more comfortable in our current political climate. You know, I just think about a current board member who wants to continue to serve their community, maybe running for county council or running for delegate or whatever, and getting hit with this. But our policy doesn't preclude them from running. If someone filed an ethics complaint, then it would go to ethics. Ethics wouldn't use our policy. Ethics uses law and precedent and COMAR and everything else to determine, is that a violation of ethics? So that final discussion helped me a lot with the question. So thank you.
So are there other questions about 109? So then the question to the panel or to the policy committee is, do you want to add the 2 paragraphs that are in 305 under gifts to 109? And then do you want to direct this to the State Ethics Commission, or do you want this to go to the board for approval before going to the State Ethics Commission? And if you want to hold off on that discussion until after we're done with 305 and do those together, because they are tied, they are related, that would certainly make sense.
I would affirm that we wait till we talk about 305 and then let's make that decision.
Sure. All right, so turning to 305, obviously there's a lot more changes in 305 than there were in 109. And again, these are the changes are for the most part all highlighted in purple. I think I missed one, but you know, I'll point that out when we get there. So you'll see that we've added some definitions for what it means to have a donation or and what is a donation campaign. And we have also added a definition, it's at the top of page 2, for out-of-season activities. And that is the term I've adopted for things like athletics, athletic camps, conditioning clinics, all of the things that were a part of the discussion that we had, that Mr. Rose, you led the questioning about at our last meeting on 305. Any questions about the 3 definitions?
For the out-of-season activities, that would be all athletics, regardless of whether they are like sponsored by FCPS boosters or an external organization.
Yes.
And it speaks to FCPS staff who have employment or are benefiting financially from those activities. So they're allowed to be part of them. It's just sort of how that occurs.
Well, and we'll get to the out-of-season activities. I mean, because rather than having to say athletics, athletic camps, and conditioning clinics associated with high school interscholastic athletics every single time, I felt like a definition would help make that a bit less cumbersome.
Would that also be applicable to activities outside of athletics? I don't know if that.
Not the way it's written, but I could certainly see a place for band or drama camp or coding camp, or I mean, there's place for it.
A lot of the the MPS, is it SSA or SAA?
MP,
SSA
SSAA.
governs most of this. So we sort of,
Yeah.
that has, it's an overarching body that's, since this is the place that occurs most primarily. So I think let's go through it and see if we feel like the naming of those all other extracurriculars is necessary. So,
All right, so
because MPSSA has its own sanctioning process and its own sort of
Yeah.
governing ethics that it uses, so.
So there are, unless there's any other questions about the definitions, there are no changes in the policy statement section. In the implementation in D1, we've added a new paragraph C that specifically makes it clear that a supervisor is not to accept a gift from a subordinate or group of subordinates unless it's permitted by the gift section down below. And this is something that the ethics panel and talked a great deal about wanting to have language in here that effectively discouraged a supervisor from accepting a gift. And this was the way that we felt that could be accomplished. There's no change in financial payment. And then if you go down to gifts at the bottom of 3 and top of 4, you'll see that that's where we incorporate language saying that it is okay to accept a gift from a group of FCPS employees, provided that no one contributes more than $20, and that it is limited to a special or infrequent occasion, so a wedding, a baby shower, that kind of event. And then this is kind of the one unique twist that the ethics panel was really concerned about, was the gift has to say that it's from the entire department. It can't be just from the individuals who paid the money, because if there's 10 people in the department and 9 contribute, you're leaving that one person out for reasons because maybe they can't afford to contribute $20 at that moment in time to the gift. Or maybe they weren't there to contribute because they were on leave or whatever reason. And it felt exclusionary to allow for the identification of the individuals. It seemed like, and the ethics panel was very interested in trying to craft it in a way that said, look, the gift is from all of us, whether you participate or not in the financial piece of it. Because I may want to give a gift to Dr. Sergo as part of a larger group, but I just can't afford to do it. But that doesn't mean I don't want to participate.
Well, I think also from a conflict of interest perspective, you don't want any supervisors to arguably be in a position to give undue favor or disdain for, I noticed Mr. Bass, he didn't help, he didn't contribute. So it neutralizes any potential benefit or harm to those members of the department as well.
Yeah. And then the paragraph at the top of page 4, that's the crowdsourced monetary gifts, the GoFundMe pages. And I mean, like I said, this came out of a Frederick County ethics decision that allowed for a crowdsourced GoFundMe page contribution, provided that if it was anonymously made, it was fine, because obviously if it's anonymous, I don't know who's made the donation. I can't do something for that person, right? There's no benefit to that person. If it is below the $20 limit and it's unsolicited, that's fine also, because you can give $20, you can receive a $20 gift. Or if it is above the $20 limit, if the contribution is from an identified donor who does not fall within the restricted categories that are defined above. And the restricted categories are those items in 3B. Someone who's doing business or seeking to do business, is subject to the authority of the board, is a regulated lobbyist, has a financial interest, or is an association, i.e. MABE. That's really what the 5th category is. And so that's the way the Frederick County ethics panel came down on that issue, and it seemed reasonable to adopt their construction. Questions about those two? Because I know that's kind of part of the conversation we were having earlier.
I have a question, just a comment, I understand the addition of the language around the individual or the outsourcing gifts or whatever. Not the GoFundMe, the one above that.
Mhm.
I think it's a difficult thing to enforce or like,
It's
but
there.
It's there, so.
It's there. As I used to do as a principal, I would remind my staff every year what it was, remind my families and my community. But to your point, no,
I mean,
it's
I would
there.
not want us to go down that.
We're not correct.
And just for a point of clarity for myself too, for the gifts, from, I don't know, like a business, doing business with the school system or seeking to do business, as long as that gift is under $20, that's acceptable, correct? I think it's the word notwithstanding in C that I'm like, does that mean you can or you can't? But you can, right? So an employee may accept a gift from a business that is
Yes,
doing business as long as that monetary value still falls under that $20.
yes.
Mhm.
That's why when we do those retirement seminars and the companies that we do our retirement through come and they have their, the water bottles or the phone cases or the
For
squishy
less than
things.
$20 worth of swag.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Other questions about or comments regarding the two new proposed gift provisions, keeping in mind, again, I have no idea if the State Ethics Commission will accept this because nobody else in the state has language like this in their policies.
But many have it in their regulations. I know.
The group gift giving, yes,
Right,
the
the
crowdsourcing,
$20 and that language does exist in other LEAs.
but the GoFundMe doesn't. That's
The GoFundMe
that's
does
new.
not, but the individual contribution language does.
No? All right. So then if you drop down to letter E in that section, it's at the top of page 4. This speaks to donations and wish lists. If you recall, we were discussing this at the last meeting. Teachers will often post, I would love to receive these supplies, and parents will often provide those supplies. I myself have taken little bottles of water over to the school for my son's class because that's what the teacher asked for. And so what this section is basically saying is that, yes, they can receive donations of supplies from a wish list in accordance with the superintendent's regulations, which we are creating. They will be ready to go by the time this policy is ready and published, approved and published. We will have those regulations ready, provided that those donations are for materials used to supplement rather than supplant FCPS programming.
And that's typically, I think, Ms. Gallagher, you raised this before. We don't want to discourage our teachers from doing it. We know that, and our community members want to find ways to help their schools. And so this creates a structure to continue what we've been doing. But certainly when members of the community raise like, oh, what's my money going to? Why is the teacher asking for these things? It's very clear this is an optional supplementation. They are not doing the job that the school system should be doing in terms of providing things. The instructional program can run without these donations. And so it just gives some cover there.
Questions about that? Okay.
I just
Right,
had a quick comment. I wanted to thank you for coming up with this language because I believe that this particular section relieves a weight from a number of our teachers. So I just wanted to thank you for coming up with this, and I appreciate the work to come up with the language.
You're very welcome. So then moving down to the next changes on page 5, in section 5, the employment, financial interests, and business entities section. It used to say and procurement, but I've moved that elsewhere in the policy. In re-looking at this, that procurement section, which is now currently listed as E, but it is all struck through, it occurred to me that this really belongs later and not necessarily within the employment, financial interest, and business entities, because this section all orients really around me as the employee, my interest in getting another job or having a financial interest or engaging in a business entity. It's kind of separate and apart from me benefiting from a procurement process. And we have language later that talks about materials, supplies, and being a part of having those items procured. So I felt like that fit better down below. And so it's not gone, it's just relocated. What is new here is a specific statement in D that employees engaged in outside employment are prohibited from benefiting from business with the school system or from relationships with students, including but not limited to engaging in recruitment or referral activities for personal financial gain. And the reason why this is here is because as we were working through this policy, we realized this was showing up both in the tuition section and in the out of season activities section. And that signaled to me that this may be a broader issue than related to just those two sections. And so this brought it more broadly applicable across the board by relocating it to the employment, financial interest, and business entities section. And thematically, it also ties in. Questions?
I have a question about that, but still in 5. Yes?
Yeah.
So it's around 5A. Which I think, as we're talking about some of the potential ways that our staff might supplement income during the summer, for example. This language seems a little restrictive in terms of if we had an employee who during the summer wanted to be employed by an entity that has a contract with the school system. So the YMCA, for example, would that be prohibited under?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so either. And
That's an example, but I have several others of like, if we contract with, let's say next year our Tutor Me contract is up and we determine that we want to contract with a local tutoring agency, this would potentially prohibit an employee.
No, as long as it's outside, you can have a second job doing anything you'd like as long as it doesn't adversely conflict with your employment with us. You couldn't do Tutor Me from your classroom on your FCPS device, and you couldn't tutor students that you work with or attend your school, but it wouldn't prevent you from working at any group or agency that it's not intended to do that.
Right. Well, I think when you look at the language, so be employed by an entity that has entered a contract with the school system or board, to take out the extra. That, I mean, I read.
So those things are, so you see how it says except as permitted by regulation of the board. So there are things that are permitted.
right. And so what Dr. Sergo is pointing to really is the key piece of the language there. So yes, there are things that an employee may not do, and that's what you see in the little 1 and the little 2, but they can do it if it doesn't create a conflict of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so going to work over the summer for a tutoring company, that's not going to create a conflict of interest because they're doing it on their own time during the summer, not using FCPS resources. There's no conflict there or appearance of conflict. But that's why D becomes so important, because it does say that this would say that, yeah, I can go work for that local tutoring company, but I can't reach out to my students and say, hey, by the way, I'm going to be working at the local tutoring company. Come, get tutoring there. Because that's the kind of relational connection that is fraught with danger, that it creates this opportunity where a teacher or another staff member, doesn't have to be a teacher per se. So Missy, no offense, not focusing on teachers, Missy. But that they're not, that it's not creating this relationship that they can direct business to their summer employer.
I think Ms. Gallagher's point is that the language in A, I think we could refine, because what I think we know it's intending to say, but it's not being communicated clearly, is you can work at another job or with another group, even if that group has a contract with us, as long as it's not a conflict of interest. And here are the conflicts of interest that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think that's coming across, because I see your point is, it makes it sound like you can't do these other things. It's not intended to say that. It's saying you can do these things as long as you don't violate the policy, like giving out your flyers for the YMCA summer camp in your classroom, that kind of thing.
I just want to make sure that we're not, and I think about like our close relationship with
Yeah,
the
no.
college, for example. and
Absolutely.
where we have a number of administrators and
Correct.
teachers who will.
I
be
think we can
employed by
soften that.
both. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can make the language say what we think it's saying more clearly. Because we don't want
Appreciate
people to, yeah, and I think like, to me, if we're trying to figure out what it says together, then that's a good sign that we could say it a little bit more simply.
Otherwise, I'm good with.
Mhm. Good.
Mr. Rose?
Could you tell I was like on pause there? I was thinking. Since you're the only one that can see me, you saw the look on my face. I think you've answered it. I always sometimes my background makes me come from the athletics perspective, and I think about the number of coaches and just teachers often that are being compensated to work in AAU programs or travel programs or summer camps for one of our many sports offerings. And I guess we're just going to make sure our administrators at the local level are reiterating with their staff, it's okay that you do these camps. But don't distribute your materials during work.
Mhm.
Yeah, and look, this is a brand new policy applicable to employees. Nothing like this exists currently. They have the kind of very vague, broad language that's in the board policy as to how it applies to our staff. And so, Dr. Sergo and our HR team and our SASA team are going to have to do a lot of work to get the word out, and our public affairs team to get the word out and to communicate and educate our staff as to what this means for them. And that, I think, Mr. Rose, includes making it clear the understanding and expectation around working at a camp or a summer camp or, whatever the activity may be.
Well, and I think, Mr. Rose, to your point, it isn't intended to restrict the work or employment of employees. It is rather to make sure that they do not use I'll use the language of the board policy, use the prestige of their office or position as an employee for financial gain. And that's a protection for them, right? So let's say if the Y is using our regular flyer distribution process to distribute flyers, that's not them as an individual employee doing something for financial gain. Or if system-wide athletics is putting out information about places that you can go for conditioning camps, or it's being done by the booster, that's fine. But the individual employee can't engage in activities through their employment that could result in financial gain. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just want to make sure we're very clear about that. And I want to make sure very clear that I am speaking as an individual board member in this regard, in that in the past, there's been a feeling of being demonized or retaliated against among coaches and teachers that feel like they're providing services to valuable services to students through camps, athletic or otherwise, but yet there's been some, I don't know, some things directed toward them that was uncomfortable. And I just want to make sure we're properly communicating that we value those resources. We value the opportunities that we give our students in the summertime. And, here's like, I think we talked about here's what you don't want to do. But we value the services that you're providing to our students over the summer, and the fact that you receive compensation for that. Good for you that you're able to supplement your income,
Right.
But that you're not violating these necessary conflicts of interest. I just want to make sure we're clear with our folks on those.
And that's how we tried to write the out of season activities, since we're sort of moving into that type of a conversation, which it's really focused on recruitment and referral. So as long as you're not involved in recruitment or referral, you should continue to run. Maybe it's a camp you're a member of. Maybe it's the camp you run yourself. You can't be involved during your work time as doing anything with recruitment, referral, planning, preparation, materials. All of that has to be on your own time. And that's sort of the threshold.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay. What you said, Mr. Rose, about athletics, I need to give a quick hypothetical.
Sure.
to ask my question. So I am the head bowling coach at my high school, because I don't think anyone has a bowling team.
That's great. I love that.
So I'm the head bowling coach at my high school, and but I am also a very prestigious bowling club team coach.
Ah,
Okay,
okay.
so and I am getting paid to do that
Yeah,
job, right?
Yeah,
So I have a lot of students that I am coaching at my school,
Yeah.
but I need them on my club team, but I also make money, a lot of money on my club
you
team.
shouldn't recruit or refer them to bowling club.
Right, and maybe there's a perception that if you're on my club team, you're gonna totally make the high school team. And if you're not, you're probably not. Does this policy cover something like that, or is that somewhere else that I haven't looked at yet?
I think that falls squarely within this
This is in this
policy.
policy, and I think the question is, what is explicitly prohibited versus what you've described in some ways as optics,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting conversation that we would then ultimately refer to the ethics panel, because what you've described, you haven't recruited anyone to your club team. You haven't told them to make the high school team, you better join this club team. You haven't said anything to
I might
them.
not have said that.
You might not have said that in the scenario.
Yes.
You've got the high school team and you've got the club team, and there may be kids on both, but you haven't done anything to influence that overtly.
Right.
If someone believes or perceives that there's some benefit,
Okay.
and there's nothing you've actively done, then you would want to seek an advisory opinion about that, because things around optics is not governed. This is supposed to reduce any potential conflicts.
Sure.
But if those are optic scenarios, and I think that, to Mr. Rose's point about athletics feeling demonized, I think that's a great example of, a lot of people are running club teams or doing conditioning clinics. We're saying the limits of this are don't recruit and don't refer. And if if there's a conversation about optics, that's outside of what this is.
And then it would go to ethics.
Mhm.
And conceivably, somebody could also make an ethics complaint.
Correct.
Of course they could. They could say, right.
Sure.
Mhm.
And there's an investigative process for the ethics that the ethics panel has set up. We haven't used it yet, so I haven't really looked too carefully at whether I think it's an appropriate process. That will come up down the road, hopefully someday, never, but but yes, there is a process for that. And as the bowling coach, if someone were to file a complaint against you, it would not be a unilateral thing. You would have an opportunity to be heard, because that is a part of every good due process. So then there's no changes to disclosure of confidential information. There's no changes in the tutoring and summer camps. And then we get to 8, which is where we added the out of season activities. Now I will say from the start, section B needs to go, because that is the exact statement that I said was in tutoring and in out of season activities that I just forgot to strike out of there. So that is the statement that we put up above in paragraph
8B.
5. 8B, yes.
8B will go.
8B will go. That is going to come out. 8A directs the superintendent to create regulations that employees may engage in out of season activities consistent with the superintendent's regulations. Those regulations are largely going to track the MPSSAA. The MPSSAA, which oversees interscholastic high school athletics. That is largely going to track, those regulations will largely track that. Otherwise, I mean, the limitations are pretty straightforward. Staff have to do these things on their own time. They can't utilize staff time for planning or phone calls or emails or inquiries or collecting fees or doing any other camp activity. That should be done outside of work. And then we felt it was appropriate to have a very clear statement that FCPS may not collect a fee from students who participate in out of season activities. So if there's a summer camp and it's being held at an FCPS field and through the appropriate process for requesting use of that field, we want to make it very clear that FCPS is not going to collect a fee for our students to go use our fields. That is not how that's going to work.
Just a clarification on that, on D. If the out of season activity is part of a booster, an FCPS booster.
Boosters, we're not actually over boosters.
Yes.
Well, that's my question.
We're not
because
over boosters, which is something I learned of late.
Yes. Just like we're not over the PTA. They are
Right, so
separate.
Boosters collects that separately and maintain, okay,
Yep.
that was my clarification, I wanted to make sure that, otherwise this statement, I think, would be enough, but, all right. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions about the out-of-season activities? Okay, so in 9, you'll see here is where 9A is where that procurement language now has been relocated into a single paragraph. And then 9E is just cleanup language. The fun change was in 10 because I really took another look at this intellectual property issue and wanted to provide a really clear, a more clear approach. I thought the way I had originally written it, it was a little legalese, maybe not quite as easy to follow and understand. So I delineate very clearly, if it's IP within the scope of your employment, it's the board's, period. There's not really much to discuss there. If it's outside the scope of your employment, it is now, I think, written in a more sequential way in that, if this is what you want to do, you need to have a meeting with the superintendent or the superintendent's designee. The purpose of the meeting is to decide whether that resulting IP will be owned by the board, by the individual, or by both. During the meeting, there are some factors that the superintendent and the designee will consider. And these are things that the board's interest is going to, I'm stating that this is the board's interest in what that meeting should include a discussion about. We can take this out. That could be moved to a regulation. If there's no specific thing that the board feels should be discussed during that conversation, or there could be other things put in. The superintendent makes the final decision on whether the project is within the scope of employment, without the scope of employment, or both, or partial, and that's in writing. The reason why that's going to be in writing is because it gives the ability of the board to then hear the superintendent's decision on appeal. So the employee has recourse if they feel the superintendent has said, this is a joint project, or this is really our work, not yours. There's an avenue for an appeal of that issue. And then that there has to be something, if we come to a conclusion that there is a joint agreement, it is joint work, then we've got to have an agreement in writing that says what that work is. And I know that there was a lot of discussion of, well, does that mean that the individual has to hire an attorney? But you know what? Yes, that may be the result that the employee, the route the employee has to take. That's a part of writing a book or creating intellectual property. You hire an attorney to file for copyright. That is, or for patent protection. That is how the world of creation works. And that's why there are attorneys who specialize in that work. And so I don't have a lot of heartburn about expecting an employee who wants to create something to ask them to say, you know what, you may want to have an attorney to help you with this.
Now, the one thing I know Mr. Blevins and I discussed, and I'll just offer here for consideration, is I would propose that D2 through V. Now, is that how you say II through V?
No, 2 through 5.
2 through 5 actually be pulled out of the board policy and part of the reg, and I'll explain my thinking. The purpose of board policy is to sort of define the intent and the spirit of what the board wants. My concern about having the regulation language or the language of implementation in here is that I would suspect with anything new, there may be refinements made, and I would hate to see us have to, and not to diminish the value of the policy committee, but it's going to be harder to make changes to the implementation. If it's in policy, it makes it a little bit more easy for us to refine it. And so I was proposing, we discussed this, but decided bring it forward in its current form, was that it end with, if you want to do something outside the scope of employment, you have to have a meeting with the superintendent, and the board really directs the superintendent to create a process to rule on that request, and that the request process be in the regulation. I just wanted to offer that
Yeah, and as Dr. Serga said, we did discuss it, and part of the reason why we decided to err on the side of leaving it here for the board is because, yes, these are implementation terms, or which really could fall into a regulation, but they are also an articulation of the board's interest in how intellectual property will be treated within the school system. And so I could see it going either way, and it really is up to the panel to decide, do you want this language as a part of the policy, or do you want to just refer it to the superintendent to create a regulation?
So your recommendation would be to keep, if we were putting it in regulation, keep D and.
Keep
one.
DI
Yep.
and take 2 through 5 out. That will show up in a superintendent's reg that'll match this. It'll be regulation 305 that would govern what these meetings look like. And then still include VI, which is the top of page 8, which says that it's subject to board appeal.
I think the only thing you might have to steal from D4 is that a direction to the superintendent to make a determination in
Yes.
writing. That would still need to be in the policy.
Me too.
Okay.
So in favor of moving it to reg? Okay.
Regulation with keeping 1 and
Yeah.
then that part of 4 and 6. Mr. Rose has given us a thumbs up, so.
Mhm.
Great.
Okay.
Those are the last
I think those are,
changes.
yeah, those really are the last substantive changes. If you go down to page 9, you'll see that the financial disclosure section looks very different. The A through D, which was what was originally proposed and is what is currently in our policy. All of that has been struck out and replaced with A, B, C, D, which are all new. So that should all be in purple. The reason for the change is really to bring it into closer alignment with what COMAR says. COMAR does not actually say principals, APs, curriculum specialists. It doesn't say that. It doesn't give a list of that. That was generated by the board when the policy 109 was created and amended. So we were in discussing it, thought, let's go back to a closer tie to what COMAR says, and instead direct the superintendent to publish a list of positions by title that are expected to report.
And that will go into our new reg as well.
Which also then gives a lot more flexibility if we need to add another position, or we decide, you know what, there is no such thing as a buyer specialist anymore, so we can take that buyer specialist out. I don't know if there are buyer specialists still. I don't think there are, but so I mean, so that's the thinking in changing the approach on the financial disclosures. And not hearing any questions. And then if you go to top of page 10, under the ethics panel, this is where we vest the authority of the ethics panel to review policy 305 items, limited to what is outlined in policy 109 for their authority, because there's a lot more in here than is in the 109. So we just wanted to have that distinction that we're not asking the ethics panel to do anything more than what they're already doing, even though the reference is now living in a policy that is more robust. And those are the changes. So that brings us back to the first question, which is, do you want the gift language incorporated into 109? And do you want this to go to the state first or to the board first?
I mean, in terms of the gift language, I feel like if we're having it in 305, it should be duplicated in the board in 109.
I agree.
Any objections to that?
Okay.
And then I'm personally a little bit conflicted on where we send it first, because I mean, my preference, I think, is to send it to the state first and then to the full board to make sure that the state accepts the language. Otherwise, if we send it to the full board, there could be a lot of discussion or, concern that we spend a lot of time on, and then the state says you can't have that in there anyways. So
We sent it to the state more than once?
Yes,
Yeah,
so
I mean-
if it comes back from the state and they've approved it, and then the board looks at it and says, well, we don't really like the crowdsourcing thing, or we don't feel we need the gift aggregating thing, we'll just notify the state, we've taken this out, or here's how we've revised it. Is this revision acceptable? The only effect is it, just delays the implementation of the new policy until we have both the state and the board on board.
Yeah. That's my preference as well, was the discomfort a little bit around either transparency, or it just feels like we might be getting ahead of.
Well, there might be things that we've updated in this policy that the full board also isn't necessarily in agreement with. And we've spent a lot of time
Mhm.
in this.
And it's a
space
brand new
talking about,
policy.
Both
Created
with
it.
109
Mhm.
and now with 305, but I don't know, to me, I think we send it to the state first and then.
And you would put that in your policy report
Yes.
update to the
Tonight.
board tonight. Yeah, I think as long as we're transparent about wanting to see what the state says about this proposal.
We want an
sense.
advisory opinion about our policy. That's essentially how I would describe it.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right.
And it has to go to them. for-
One way or the other, before we can implement it, it has to go to the state commission. So if we were to choose the route of go to the board first, on the policy analysis page where there's this, what is the timeline for implementation, it will be after the board, after the state approves whatever is decided upon by the board.
Can I offer a third option? Why can't we pursue both paths simultaneously? And we submit it to the state ethics, is it ethics pop, what's it?
The State Ethics Commission.
Ethics Commission, while we engage in a first reading. And, sort of reconcile the results of both groups back here at Policy Committee. That's sort of a third option that wouldn't make it sequential, but would sort of make it more interactive.
Do we have any idea how long it takes at the state level? Because that's the
I-
other thing.
That's
like,
why I
we,
was-
we have one board meeting in December.
That's what I'm saying, you
It's
could-
not on our agenda. It probably won't be until January. So we could submit
Yes.
to the
Could.
state. Who knows how long they.
I was more suggesting that you not necessarily feel bound to wait for one to start the other. You could put this on an future board meeting agenda, and we may have information back, but we may not. And yet it doesn't preclude the conversation. And when the information comes, either way, it's going to the board and coming back to here, right? Either way. So if it doesn't get on the December 6th agenda, it'll be, which it won't, okay?
No.
So we're looking at January
Yes.
anyway. So it would,
Yeah, we could certainly do that, as long as if we get to the meeting in January or February, whenever this makes it onto the board's agenda, if we haven't gotten an opinion back from the state, we have to be very clear in the discussion that this whole discussion is all subject to the state's approval of whatever it is we ultimately accept.
I'm comfortable with that.
Mr. Rose?
Yeah, having some insight on the agenda setting. I like Dr. Sergo's suggestion. I think it'd be important to go ahead and let's get this on a future agenda in the hopes that maybe we'll have an opinion back from the state. But if not, we can preface our discussion when we have it, most likely the end of January 24th, most likely. But I think for the most efficient use of the board's time, I appreciate that suggestion.
So I know we have one more agenda item to get to, and we're running low on time, but we did start this discussion with the question of, do we want to extend this to non-athletic extracurricular activities? Drama, band.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question as we were going through it, and sort of where I landed, just to offer you insight, is out of season activities in the way we've defined it here, is limited to athletics. So actually, I think the language of out of season activities works in all cases, we would just need to modify the definition and just say, I would then propose that we say out of season activities is defined to mean, and add, I don't know what the right term is, but sort of any extracurricular inclusive of athletics and the arts, or bowling or whatever. I don't think we need to have an exhaustive list, but just anything that's outside the student day, something like that. And then we don't,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? What do you think about that? I think the definition is the issue.
Curricular
right? Yeah. And extracurriculars defined as outside the student day.
Yeah. So that brings us to policy 314, the much discussed policy 314. This is only for information and discussion. This is not here for an action item, because I wanted to make sure that we were clear about the instruction about how we should be revising the draft of this. And so walking out of the November 8th board meeting, these were the kind of the topics of concern that I captured in my notes. Partisan voter registration is potentially an issue, and voter registration being used as a civics lesson is something that may be supported by the board. Signs around election signs taking more than 24 hours is too long, that it should be the next by the next morning. Restoring work time in favor of workplace. There was a question about how does this impact virtual work, and I think that's part of where we need to have some discussion, because I don't know that I know the answer to that. And then there was a question about, can we make some kind of limitation of the use of FCPS property or assets in political campaign ads? So having candidates who come in and take pictures in the school with staff or with students, or the use of buses, as part of the pictures of our buses. Is there a restriction we can create around that? I am of the opinion that there is probably very little restriction we can do there, but that's, this isn't my policy, this is your policy. So those are the areas that I had noted for discussion. Dr.
And then I had one
Sergio.
other, which was under DB. We had discussion about the notion of the term workplace versus workday. It had been workday previously, it had been changed to workplace, but having now reflected on the conversation of the board and really thinking about the rights of our labor partners as the exclusive bargaining agents, it would be my suggestion to change that word back to workday, so that we don't create.
Work time. That's what it says.
Work time, sorry. Whatever the language is, to make it go back to what it was before, as would be an additional proposal that I would submit to the board.
One question I have, I do think, Mr. Blibus, you summarized our discussion from November 8th well. I was surprised when you said you don't see a restriction that we would be able to effectively do of using school buses or school property in campaign ads. I guess I thought that would actually be pretty easy and straightforward. What concern are you seeing with that?
I think you have a cross-section of a host of election laws that provide for what you can and cannot do during campaigning. I think you also have a First Amendment question. And look, at the end of the day, if I'm standing on the side of the road and I see a FCPS bus drive by and I snap a picture of that bus, how are we ever going to regulate that? How are we ever going to enforce any restriction on that? Maybe there's space to say, if a candidate comes into an FCPS school during the work time or the work day, and pictures, they cannot take pictures with our staff. But then are you infringing upon the staff member's First Amendment right to show their support for that candidate by being in the picture? It's a very challenging area, honestly.
Right, because they're not subject to board policy. These individuals, how would we police that? You know what I'm saying? And other than, we'd have to have somebody going around looking at materials and then sending them sort of cease and desist letters, which I'm not sure is really what the board was ultimately after.
In some ways, right, I think that part was driven by, I actually don't remember all the details, but I think there was a commercial or a pamphlet with where certain candidates were in front of a school. And so I think I agree that unfortunately, policing every is going to be difficult. But if it's our intention that FCPS facilities are here for learning and are here for also, community resource, but not for political backgrounds in ads, then we put that in the policy and we, do our best to stick to that. But to not state it in the policy would then mean that the board isn't stating any view on that.
I think someone would challenge our right to restrict that.
I do think you would have, I'd have to spend some real time diving into the election campaign laws. I can say from a First Amendment side, I think you are going to have an issue with that kind of restriction, even if it's content neutral. I think you're going to have some challenges with that. That does, if that's the direction that the panel, that the policy committee wants to go, because that's the feedback that was heard by the board. That's why we're doing information and discussion and not action, because I would work on that. But
yeah, I guess.
Well, what you could say, Mr. Bass, trying to sort of get at your interest under a policy statement. It's possible. I'm trying to find where the yes is in here, and I'd like, I'm sure Mr. Rose and Ms. Gallagher would want to weigh in. Could add language, say, to the extent allowable by law, it is the preference of the Board of Education to not have FCPS facilities and likenesses as part of election materials. It's to the extent allowable by law, acknowledges legal precedent, and it's not a yes, no, it's a preference statement, right? So we don't, I'm infringing on anybody's right. We've been very clear that we prefer that not to happen if that's the will of the board. So I just thought I'd just try to offer another consideration or approach that might get at your interest.
That would make sense to me.
Mr. Rose or Ms. Gallagher?
Well, I will say, and I believe this is, frankly, this is being, I guess I could say, weaponized or used within our community. I do worry that any language that we put into a policy which restricts the public use of a public taxpayer-funded facility, regardless of whether it's for campaigning or otherwise, might rise to a challenge. And I'm not interested in fighting that battle. I don't think that's the purpose of this policy. My concern is, and I would love to see if it's possible to put this language in there, is that we as existing board members not use the power or status of our office to have access to facilities not otherwise accessible by all candidates. That would be more my concern, is that, because people talk about that favoritism. That's the whole thing that got the discussion about the flyers being put into boxes, is that some people had more access than others. So I'm not interested in necessarily restricting public access outside of what are our safety issues and what are individual school issues and administration, but that we would use the power of our position to walk into a school and film some sort of political ad or something like that. I just would like an opinion on that.
Mr. Rose, I think there's potentially room to do something like that. I don't think that directly falls within 109, although maybe prestige of office could be arguably used to consider that way. I don't think it belongs in 314, though. I think that would belong in one of the 100 series policies, because those are the policies that are really directed towards the board members, whereas 314 is oriented towards our staff. So I don't think it's an idea we should, just discard out of hand. I just don't know that it belongs here for that discussion.
No, I appreciate that. I think what I was trying to articulate there is I think it addresses some of the public concerns. Is like you said, we would use the prestige of our position to gain access to areas that others wouldn't have. Because I do agree with your all's position that when we're looking at public taxpayer funded facilities, we get on a slippery slope if we start trying to restrict access, particularly outside. If you're talking about somebody standing on the property and in the background is a school, I think you would be hard pressed to not be violating First Amendment, rights there. So I agree with that.
And I would suspect that local, state, and national election policies permit that.
I mean, if I happen to live next door to a school and I happen to support candidate A, and candidate A comes to me and says, hey, I want to do a promotional ad on your lawn, and
Schools in the
the
background.
school happens to be in the background, I mean, what can we do about that? Other than state a policy statement, which would not be in the implementation section, it would be in the policy statement section, that it is the preference that our facilities and assets not be used in that way. But I mean, I don't know. I agree. I'm not sure that there's any real way to police or regulate that.
I see a big difference between inside and outside access. I mean, I have access to several different schools because I work in them all the time as a volunteer. So, and I've got great relationships with staff members that'll let me into their classrooms, whatever. But I think from a community member standpoint, I feel like the access, I mean, there's school buses driving around all day long. They're at the Safeway parking lot, they're
Right.
everywhere, right? So, and I feel like as a taxpayer, our community, we sort of all own that together, right? So I kind of feel like the school buildings and the buses from the outside, everyone has access to that. Anyone can go take a picture in front of a school or find a bus to take a picture in front of, as long as it's not violating, student rights. I see a big difference with the access that Mr. Rose had pointed out. And that's what I was thinking, inside versus outside. Even inside a school bus versus outside. You shouldn't be you don't need to be in a school bus.
Right.
Sometimes I am, but
Right. Well,
But
and so
that's,
that's an
different.
interesting point, because to me, you talk about controls. So we have a process for, interviews, a process to get approval for things, and we would have a process for someone to get access to a building, right?
Right.
So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, but I think in both cases, we have a process. You can't get into a building without approval. Why you're there has to be clarified. That one I would be less concerned about, but I think regulating universal access, I think, to Mr. Rose's point, could be complicated.
So we've already discussed the restoring work time versus workplace. We've talked about and we're not doing this in the order that I listed them. So we've talked about the limitation of assets in campaign ads. We've talked about this notion Mr. Rose had of existing board members not having access to things that other potential candidates would not have access to. That leaves us with, I don't know that there's much discussion to be had about the 24 hours is too long for signs. I think that was pretty clear discussion. We want them down the next morning before school starts, before the start of the school day. That leaves us with really two items to talk about, and that is one, the voter registration drives, and whether partisan voter registration drives are permissible, and the limitation and the virtual work.
Can I ask a quick question before we get to that? The work time versus the workplace, that would address the employee unit's concern that,
That Ms. Dirk so eloquently spoke about during
Yes.
public comment? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I think it makes sense to switch from, back to the original work time. Yes.
So partisan voter registration. I know that there was some discussion from the dais about whether partisan voter registration is permitted. The way it's written now, any partisan or nonpartisan group that seeks to sponsor a voter registration drive, can do so, but they must receive prior written approval. What is the board's will here? What is it that we're looking to do with voter registration?
I don't see why we would want to have partisan voter registration drives. I want students to have the access and ability to register to vote. I think that can be done in a nonpartisan way, either by the Board of Elections. Perhaps there are some nonprofits that would be deemed nonpartisan. Perhaps League of Women Voters, probably League of Women Voters. But to have to have the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Green Party holding a voter registration drive in the school feels not appropriate.
So the caution here is that you have to be very careful of running afoul of the First Amendment. We have the right to restrict time, manner, and place as long as it is facially neutral. And so I would have to do some research into whether partisan versus nonpartisan is facially neutral versus, as opposed to, obviously we all know we can't say we're not going to allow libertarians to do this, but Republicans and Democrats can, right? We know we can't do that. That would not stand a challenge. But can you say partisan versus nonpartisan? I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to research whether the very fact that you have a political perspective which is what a partisan group would have, is enough to say that it is not content neutral.
So you're saying we wouldn't have to say more because if it's a partisan group, it's not content neutral, so that would violate.
Well, what I'm saying is if the idea is we don't want to let any partisan group, no matter what their political bend is, but we're okay with nonpartisan groups, and I would take the Board of Elections out of that discussion altogether because the Board of Elections is a governmental agency. They're not a nonpartisan group, but the League of Women Voters, I don't know if they're nonpartisan or not, but for the sake of the discussion, let's assume they are nonpartisan. Whether I can say the League of Women Voters are okay, but the Republican Party is not, that I don't know whether we can do.
Again, I'm always trying to find a way through. I might also, do we have we don't have a regulation 314, do we? Because we're trying to make sure we have paired regulations for every policy. And some of what strikes me about this particular section is what it basically says simply is that if you want to do a voter registration drive, you have to get permission. And so I'm wondering if sort of that's the board policy. We support voter registration, and you have to get permission to engage in those activities in our buildings during the student day. And then what we would do is we would create a regulation that describes that approval process and what are the factors that are weighed. And we have a lot more latitude in terms of refining that. That's just another suggestion to consider. Both of those, though, are still predicated on Mr. Blivis's research around what that looks like. But if my recollection of this interest number of months back, even last year, I think it was a year ago, through public comment, was about how we can encourage civic engagement. Right. And so the notion of what we can do to create opportunities for students to register to vote. I know Brooke Lieberman has spoken about this, the importance of civic engagement. So how can we create a process for that? To me, lives in a regulation, which we don't currently have. But this is another idea to consider to preserve the interest of the board, which is to support voter registration.
And I think actually that's Dr. Serga's suggestion is one that we should consider very seriously. I think that while the regulations live with the superintendent, having this discussion will help us in preparing those regulations. So even if it ends up being that all we say is voter registrations are good, go, yay, do it, just get permission first. What that permission process looks like will be informed by this conversation.
And not because I like my own idea, but I will say I like this part of it, which is it doesn't remove the right to appeal. So if the superintendent's regulation was to deny someone's access to our buildings for voter registration, the board could hear that appeal of that denial. That would still exist.
Yeah.
And the board could then make a final determination.
I do have something else to say, but I'm conscious that I don't think my colleagues have given their views on it.
Thumb up from Mr. Rose.
I mean, I don't have any objection to the language that's in here as it is, because I do think that it hits the point of there must be the approval to sponsor this voter registration. And so we could, and I certainly don't want our policy to be restricting First Amendment rights or,
Mhm.
so, I mean, I think we will need to develop a regulation regardless, and some of this language in here might fall under the regulation already. So I'm not opposed to more research on whether we can specify partisan or nonpartisan or state or local
Mhm.
government. I think that's inclusive of everybody, but I don't feel strongly one way or another as long as we're compliant with the
Mhm.
law.
Oh, right, for sure. I wanted to mention one more thing, Mr. Bass, going back to your point about facilities and board policy 203, which hasn't been updated in about 8 years. It's called Facilities and Grounds. It speaks to the use of school facilities and grounds and identifies some limitations, including gambling. It's interesting. So gambling, bingo is prohibited. We're not allowed to do bingo. It's just interesting to me. Raffle, there's limit lists there, but I wonder, there's an item about restrictions for community use, charges for school facility, events held off school property, and exception. I actually am wondering if the interest that you've elevated might be a more appropriate part of revising this particular policy, which talks about the use of our facilities for a variety of things, because it seems to be a sort of a variety of things are identified here. I just wanted to offer that as another on-ramp to having the conversation that is not limited to 314. I didn't want to lose sight of that, but Mr. Bass, I know you were about to share something. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I mean, certainly the research, Mr. Blivus, is important because we cannot create a policy that would be in direct violation of the law. So
Right.
certainly that's a baseline. I think we live in a hyper-partisan world, and I think it will be a distraction. I think it would be a real distraction to Republican students if the Democratic Party is regularly holding voter registration drives. I think that it would be a distraction to Democratic students if the Republican Party is regularly holding voter registration drives.
And to the point of the regularly holding, one of the factors to consider that would be considered in approving a voter registration drive is the number of voter registration drives that have been held and the disruption that registration drive will have on the school. So, I mean, those are certainly things that would have to be factored in. I think you're 100% correct. Those are things that would have to be factored in deciding whether to permit a voter registration drive.
Yeah, and I think to your point, one of the things we all, I think, want to avoid is the things that are polarizing topics, right? And in that manner, I wonder if like A3 was the question is A3, is that language intended to suggest it either has to be partisan or representative, nonpartisan or balanced? I think that's what I read. When I read A3, it sort of says, to use your example, is that intended to, you see what I'm saying? Yeah, go ahead.
If I understand what you're saying, I mean, I think in my first year on the board, the local Democratic Party, in emailing us, asking for a voter registration drive, said, oh, don't worry, we'll also invite the Republicans. And my personal response to that, I don't think it was the response of the board, but my personal response to that is, no, you're missing the point. Like, I understand you're looking to do this as a two-party thing, and still you're missing the point.
You're
Right.
saying
This
just
should be a
not partisan, not right.
nonpartisan, this should be a civic engagement. This should not be connected to party politics.
Because at a very, kind of philosophical, theoretical level, by don't worry, we'll invite the Republicans also, it re-ingrains this two-party system that may or may not function well.
That's exactly right.
We'll look at the language and the permissibility of the revisions here.
So the one other item that was touched upon during the board meeting was virtual work. And my notes, other than have virtual work, I don't have any notes on what the issue there was. So
Virtual work?
yeah.
I think it was in relation to the workplace language.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
that solves.
Yeah, okay.
Gotcha.
Day or work time,
Yeah.
then that should-
We have a teleworking regulation.
Yeah.
So I
And so
think it was just that concern
Yeah, but that's solved by going back to the original language.
I did want to raise one other item if you have, when we're done,
I mean,
which is not 314. So are we?
yeah, I mean, 314 was information and discussion. So unless there's any other feedback from the panel, that's going to come back to you. We'll try and have this a revised draft ready for the December virtual session.
So the one other item, if you wouldn't mind me speaking to, is the policy committee or the full board. I think this came out of a full board discussion at our last meeting around the notion of a quote cell phone policy. And so I had done some research and looked at this. I actually don't think that this requires revision of any board policy, but there are two existing superintendent's regulations, one of which more directly speaks to this than another. And of course, I just closed my computer and I wanted to tell you what it was, but it's 400-18, I believe. It's called Responsible Use of Technology. Hold on. Yep, 400-18. And that is the policy that's the regulation that currently speaks to this notion of cell phones or personal mobile devices. And so I have asked a couple of individuals, our middle school director, our high school director, and a member of the student services team that worked on the code of conduct, because there's a crosswalk, to start looking at what are some ways that we can tighten up that regulatory language to give the support to our parents and frankly, our school staff, most notably our teachers and administrators, that will reduce the variability that we see around what is and is not permitted. While we think most people support off and away types of practices, the current superintendent's regulation does not give any sorts of directive. And so I don't think it lives in board policy. I don't think that's work that needs to come back here, but we are going to be looking at that in terms of a superintendent's regulation.
So it's regulation 400-18, which is electronic devices student use, and then 400-73, which is responsible use of digital technology students. Those are the two regulations that Dr. Sergo is referring to.
So there is a group that's going to start working on some regulatory, because this is where it is right now, and it sort of makes sense to keep that where it is currently and just bring some strength to it and some polish.
I'm sorry, Ms. Rebecca, what's the second regulation?
400-73,
Yeah.
responsible use of digital technology students. Because there is a corresponding responsible use of digital technology staff.
So there is,
Part of my take is our goal changes in practice, or do we want to have a more public discussion about it? I think that it would be better than where we're at if the regulation is clarified and that principals and teachers understand the regulation, but there is a way that board policy allows for a more public discussion. I don't know what is better, but that's a distinction I see.
well, so one of the things in looking at this was I was looking sort of across LEAs. Most have this in their regulatory or administrative procedures. It's not a board policy. But I think what you're describing is really important. And so at a minimum, while this is not historically done, I might suggest there is a presentation to the public and the board about this topic to receive, thoughts and feedback.
And the RRC, the Regulation Review Committee,
Includes
is a cross-section of the community, our union partners, our principals, our staff. So we have a pretty broad range of individuals who participate in the process of the regulations as it stands now.
So would you suggest it goes to the committee, the regulation committee first, and then with updates, recommendations, then coming back and being presented?
and to Mr. Bass's point, I mean, if it's the will of the board for us to create a policy, we certainly can do that. I was looking for I always try to say, instead of creating something from scratch, is there anything that we can bolster and enhance? And when I looked at 400-18, I was like, oh, well, this is where it is right now, right? So it already lives in policy. And so the electronic device of student use regulation, which was updated in 2019, it's not that long ago, does have in items B, 2, and 3, this idea of restrictions to, is it 2, 3, and 4? But it's very, it gives a lot of autonomy, and autonomy is a wonderful thing at the school level, but I think in our conversations and certainly in talking with FCTA as well and PACASA, I think people are looking for some policy language, not policy, some regulatory language to give them cover so that they can finally create some more restrictions and have less variability. So I thought, well, if we just polish what's here up a little bit, it may accomplish that. But whatever you prefer, we will do.
Can I, just given where we are on time,
Yeah.
and, this was not a topic on our
No.
agenda for today, but could we potentially place this discussion
Absolutely.
on our December
We
6th
can.
virtual meeting? And that will give maybe our policy committee a little time to look at both of these regulations a little bit more in depth. And then we can.
The only caution is it's not under the purview of the policy committee to review superintendent's regulation.
Right.
No, but it
But we
is,
could discuss the notion of a cell phone policy and whether or not the board wants to do that. I would want to organize that
Yeah.
agenda item more purposefully. It wouldn't be our job to review 400-18.
And if I could,
Yeah.
sorry, since I kind of am the one that brought this up, that speaks to why I brought it up. Is it's not in the purview of the board to guide regulation, and there is no policy that guides regulation. So that's why I brought it up, that what is the will of the board? How is the will of the board governed in regulation? It's not without a policy.
Right. So I would say if you're asking me what is the source policy for 400-18, I think if you look at the bottom, because they do speak to that. Interestingly, much of 400-18 is anchored to our bullying, harassment, and intimidation policy. That's the crosswalk.
And it also, interesting enough, because that's why one of the reasons the regulation needs revised is it references 400-08, which no longer exists.
Right.
So,
that's just been renumbered. It's a technical change that we would
Yeah.
fix.
and I think a lot of it has to do with our student code of conduct too, that
Correct.
there
Student
needs to be
discipline would be
references
the
to
other.
that. We talk a lot about that the board's job is the what and staff is the how. And I just struggle to find what is our stance? What is the board's stance on the use of electronic devices? And I feel like the community, or at least they've reached out to me and staff. I've heard from teachers as well. The community has reached out to me personally and asked me, what is our stance? How do we stand? So I would vote that we have a presentation on the regulation to the full board
Once it's been revised, you're saying, or in the
process.
Yeah, so I will bring that back to Dr. Dyson and share that interest. And I think if you're asking what the source policy is, it is student discipline, because we're governing the behavior of students using their devices. And so that is the policy. And so if you were to say, how do we communicate what we believe as a board, I would then point us back to student discipline as a potential anchor policy.
Okay.
Or,
Which is in our 400.
Which is in our 400, it's policy
Okay.
403.
And
or
then
student
maybe
rights and responsibilities.
in
Or
review
like-
of that policy, we need to address what the board's will is on
Correct.
electronic devices.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would get it.
Thank you. Sorry
Do you
about that.
still want this on the agenda for next?
No, let's-
Okay.
Let's follow that approach.
And that makes sense, again, because that's why the group that's going to be working on the 418 revisions is the same group that will be working on the 400 series policies. So it's the same, it's under the guise of student behavior, student support, student discipline, that whole thing governing students is in the 400 series.
Great. Thank you for the discussion.
So I think that brings us to the last item on the agenda, which is adjournment. Mr. Bass has departed because we were approaching the 12 o'clock hour. So it has to be unanimous between Mr. Rose and Ms. Gallagher that you want to move to adjourn.
Let's adjourn.
Sure, I agree.
All right, so
Thank
Mr.
you.
I'll make a
Rose.
motion to adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
I was about to say aye. I'm like, waiting for somebody to.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
See you all this afternoon.
No problem.
Thank you.